Richard, I'm told that the God I'm supposed to believe in is omniscient, meaning God knows everything, not only of the past and the present, but of the future, because God could know today what will happen. That's a proposition. That's true or not today. So God knows everything in the future. So if that's true, and if God expects me to have free will and judging me on free will, that sounds like a contradiction.
Yes, I'm inclined to agree with you. If God really did know everything that I am going to do tomorrow, I cannot do it freely, because to say that tomorrow I am free to choose whether to mow the lawn or not implies it's up to me then and there to decide. But if God knows beforehand, knowledge entails belief, so God believes beforehand, say that I will mow the lawn. And in that case, I have it in my power to make it false that God will mow the lawn. And in that case, God can't be omniscient. That is to say, there is an apparent contradiction here between divine omniscience, understood in this full sense, and human freedom. Well, of course, some theologians have wanted to say, well, that just shows humans aren't free, and some theologians are quite happy with that. But even if you do say that, there is the issue of God's own knowledge of his own future actions, and they traditionally are certainly said to be free. And then, of course, people try and avoid that by the notion of divine timelessness, which I think is itself incoherent. So this is a path I don't want to go down. And we must look at the notion of omniscience again. Thomas Aquinas made the point that omnipotence has to be understood as the power to do anything logically possible. Indeed, he had a marvelous chapter which is in the Summa Contra Gentiles entitled How God is Said to be Unable to Do Various Things, and they include 25 such things. Now, my suggestion is that we should treat omniscience in a similar way. That is to say, omniscience is knowledge of all that's logically possible to know. For the reason given, it is not logically possible to know our future free actions. So if God gives us freedom, then he can't know what we are going to do tomorrow. And therefore, omniscience shouldn't be understood in that sense. I think omniscience must be understood as knowledge of all that's logically possible to know, and that means all about the past, all that God predetermines for the future, all necessary truths and so on, but it doesn't include free choices, either by God or by us, if he gives us free choices. Of course, it's only by his choice that we have free choices, so it's his choice to limit his own knowledge in this way. I think that's the only coherent way to understand omniscience.
Many theologians would violently disagree, because they would say what you have done is gutted God's providential power to make absolutely sure that we can have confidence in the future. With that type of an open God, an open future that God cannot control 100% sure, that puts all of our futures in some doubt.
I don't think so, because God can cut not everybody, in my view, is free all the time, and God can take away our freedom in a second. So if things are beginning to get out of control, as it were, in the universe, God can just abolish our freedom. Or if Hitler was really likely to overrun the whole world, then if God thought this was a bad thing, he could just turn Hitler off, as it were, turn his freedom off. So there's no risk of things getting out of control. But what this does is enables us to have a genuine freedom of a limited kind, subject to God allowing us, not making us, but allowing us to exercise that freedom. And that is a great good for us, and a great good which we cannot have unless he is prepared to, for logical reasons, unless he's prepared to limit his freedom in this way. And there are a number of biblical passages which do imply very strongly that God is ignorant of the future. future. You may know the story of the prophet Jonah, who prophesied to the people of Nineveh that they would, the people of Nineveh had behaved badly, and God told Jonah to prophesy, you will be destroyed in 60 days, but they repented, and therefore God did not destroy them. And Jonah sulked and said, what a bad thing this was. But of course, what God said is, isn't it better this way? And that, of course, implied that he didn't know what the future was, because he'd told Jonah to prophesy this. And then there's that marvelous statement just before the story of the flood in the book of Genesis, where the story is that the human race had behaved very badly, so that God brought the flood, and only Noah and his family were saved in the flood. But he brought this flood when he saw how people had behaved badly. And what it says in Genesis is God saw the wickedness of man and repented that he had made the world, which clearly
Very
implied
powerful.
things had gone wrong in the way that he didn't expect. So there is significant biblical
and many
authority for
theologians are
this.
very unhappy with those passages and try
Yes,
to explain
indeed.
it with a God that's
Indeed
a
they
timeless
do.
God, and
Indeed.
because to undermine in any sense God's absolute providence goes against the core understanding of many aspects, certainly of Christianity. Now, there are different mechanisms by which they get around this problem, keeping God's providence, keeping God's control, and yet still allowing human freedom, because most want to allow human freedom. Some don't
Yes,
in a
no,
predestination,
that's right,
but
that's
most
right,
do.
that's right.
And they do it through God foreknowledge, where foreknowledge is just sort of seeing without controlling. They do it with a timeless God who's outside of time, so everything is equitemporal, as it were. They have all these mechanisms. There's something called middle knowledge, where God knew when he created the universe that if he did it in a certain way, that he knew in advance what people would do in
Yes.
circumstances, so they have the freedom of the creaturely freedoms, but God structured everything so that those freedoms would go the way God wanted it to. So of all these different ways to
I don't think
achieve
any
the
of
same.
them make sense. I mean, if you take Molinism, which is the doctrine that God first saw with respect to all the people he might make, how they would behave freely in certain circumstances, and in the light of that chose to just create some of them, knowing how they would behave in those circumstances. Now, I don't think it makes any sense to suppose that God can know how somebody whom he might not even create, what that person would do freely in certain circumstances. He might know what they would do if they were predetermined to do it, but to know what they would do freely in certain circumstances doesn't make sense, because they can only to say that someone acts freely is to say that at that time they choose to act one way rather than another without being predetermined which to act. But if they're never made, there's no truth about what they would do, because the only truth about what they would do would be constituted by what they will do, and what they will do is not going to happen because they're not going to be made. And likewise, I can't see how, even if he creates certain people and really gives them freedom, he can foreknow infallibly. Of course, he may know what their character suggests more probable than not.
It has to be infallible.
Infallibly what they will do, because if they're really free, it depends on them at that moment. And that means, as I gave in the previous argument, if it really does depend on them in that moment, they would have the power to make any belief of his false. So all of these have internal contradictions, I think, and the only way out of it is what I've suggested.
And you recognize that most theologians are very much opposed to that position, because it degrades the power of God to bring about God's will on earth.
It doesn't degrade it very much because, as I say, if things start getting out of hand, God can easily abolish human freedom just like that. So I don't think it carries any long-term consequences, but it does mean that God doesn't control how we actually choose, and that's a great benefit for us, and I think it's a great generosity of God to give us this freedom. And God takes the logical consequences of what he does. As I say, there is certain biblical authority for it, but you're undoubtedly right that the vast majority of Christian tradition for the middle centuries of Christianity is virtually unanimous in that regard, but it's never been declared a doctrine of the church one way or the other by some council. So I think I am only extrapolating what is implicit in certain biblical texts, and other theologians have said it down the years, and one or two theologians of significant merit have said it at one or two times, but the vast majority are against me. You're quite right, but I don't think it's formally heretical.